You've discovered the Technoprogressive Hub. Join us to fight for a high-tech and radically democratic future. Welcome, gentlemen. Today we're going to tackle a thorny question for technoprogressives, which is that the left in general, as many Americans, left and right now, there's also people on the right who are anti-AI, but many American leftists and liberals have decided that AI is the worst thing since moldy bread and that they need to put a stop to it all. And that's obviously not the techno-progressive position. We have been arguing against that for a long time. We think that you need to look for the liberatory opportunities with AI. But at the same time, we are sympathetic, I think, and we will get into it, with some of the critiques of unchecked, unregulated innovation, and in particular, in this case, the building out of AI data centers. But let's start at the top with the political question, because there is Bernie and AOC have proposed legislation. There's substantial support when that legislation or the elements of that legislation have been pulled. Substantial support, and if this is a horse that the Democratic Party is going to be riding, Liz Warren is in favor of this kind of regulation as well. How much do we want to get trod under the horse, saying stop, you're going the wrong direction? And on the other hand, maybe that's all our whole point, and that's our position on everything with the left, since there's a dominant anti-tech bias on the left, which is why we exist as an organization. So let's start with Matteo, because you have been looking into some of these questions. How do you feel about this balance that we're going to strike?
Well, I do think that it is a bit, a bit of a broad brush to just think about AI in these ways as just whether there's an existential. I think that a lot of the left today primarily either thinks about AI as an existential risk mostly in a negative sense, that it's going to destroy society, destroy the world really through war. And I think there's a lot to say about that. And there's a lot of, points in favor of that position, that if we automate various parts of the war machine, that it could be very bad. But it then comes to the way that Kamala Harris used existential risk, which was to the economy and to people's jobs and effectively to the survivability of the working class. So it would be existential in that sense. It's not the end of the world or extinction, but ordinary people won't be employable in many sectors. Entire sectors of the economy will be automated. And this has been a topic of discussion for some time, but it is now reaching kind of a fever pitch where there's a discussion about entry-level jobs disappearing and many jobs for drivers disappearing. And obviously you see every day a tech CEO or someone else saying that, we have 12 months or 18 months left until there's no jobs, or there's 90% or 95% of jobs are gone. And it's going to be fine eventually, but, well, there might be some period where people don't have enough to eat, and that's the thing.
Just to be clear, you're anxious that we shouldn't get too far into the existential risk territory, and you're putting also in that category believing that there's going to be imminent technological jobocalypse, right?
I think those are the two fears of most people on the left today, which is the automation of war and, the use of AI in drone targeting and various other technologies, as we're seeing in Iran. Not just in Iran, this has been, at least for the last decade, there's been a use of AI in battlefields, but under the Trump administration, they're really wanting to spend a lot of money and to, do proof of concepts, and they're using Iran as a kind of testing ground. It's not going all that well, but it's showing that some of these technologies can be used powerfully by various militaries. So I think a lot of people assume that if they're allowed to continue to experiment, then that will lead to more experimentation and lead to more conflicts just to prove the technology. As nation building in the past was like an excuse for taking over countries. Like if you just take over a country that's in chaos, you can stay there for a long time and you can use it to kind of build up profit out of reconstruction. The same with AI. If you have a battlefield, you can then test this technology, and that itself is a huge risk that it could lead to more conflict, even if the technology doesn't improve. But if
Right.
it does, even significantly worse things could happen.
Okay.
And we could
But
have
I think
automatic
we all three agree that there is some risk of a runaway AI doing bad things to humanity, and there is even more risk of technological unemployment, right? Ellie, you agree with that, don't you?
Yeah, yeah, of course. I think
Yeah,
that that's a
yeah.
pretty non-controversial statement.
Okay. And so it may be problematic that Bernie is listening to Hinton and Eliezer Yudkowsky and mobilizing a P-doom argument that, there's 25% risk that we're going to be whacked as humanity, that all of us are going to be killed, as Eliezer says. That may be hyperbolic and unfortunate that he's going that direction. But so where do you land on this question of our political relationship to the anti-AI focus of the Democratic left?
Yeah, so my name is also Eliezer, Ellie for
That's right.
short. So I'll take another Eliezer's position on this. So I guess just to kind of to level set on this, because we haven't really defined this yet. Senator Sanders and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez introduced this bill that would pause construction of AI data centers until federal safeguards are in place that impact energy costs, environment, workers, the economy, and it also bans or limits the export of AI infrastructure to countries without similar protections. So that I think is kind of the fair way to present the bill. I know we're going to get into the policy in a bit, but I just want to take a few minutes to talk about the message and kind of, James, what you were talking about, or how techno-progressives should think about this in terms of positioning and the left and the message that we want to send to people. Because I think that's really important for this bill in particular, because this is a messaging bill. There's no expectation that it's going to pass the House and the Senate this Congress. There's certainly no expectation that President Trump is going to sign it into law, but messaging bills are important. They define for people where parties stand, where groups of members stand, what their values are, what they value, who they value, what they prioritize. And my concern is that this bill, as the message from the left on AI, sends the wrong message and moves us in the wrong direction. So I think this bill puts the left very much on that conservative Luddite side. It focuses exclusively on risk. It articulates no vision for harnessing the benefits of the technology to help everyone. And it very much is that neo-Luddite. We need to stop. We need to slow down. So I want to say, James, you're definitely putting your finger on something real here. People are angry. Democrats are looking for ways to harness that anger. Progressives are looking for ways to harness that anger. It's justified. We have to take it seriously. But I think we could channel that anger in a more productive way, in a way that leads to someplace better. So the bill basically says AI is moving too fast. It's risky. Let's pause the infrastructure until it catches up. And that sounds reasonable. These kind of arguments often sound reasonable. And I know it's, James, as you alluded to, kind of it's tempting for techno-progressives to say why, the tide of the public is moving in this direction. People are so pissed off. Let's just say pause. Let's accept this. But I worry a lot about that. I think that whenever we as techno-progressives or people who care about these kind of issues adopt their frame, accept the Luddite positioning, we're not, I don't think it benefits us. I think it just validates that frame, it entrenches it, and it makes it harder to articulate the vision that we want people to articulate. I think that there's a different way of framing this. I think there's a better way of framing this. I think that we can highlight the benefits we see if we get this right, not just the risks. our primary message doesn't have to be should we slow it down, but rather who benefits from it? How do we steer it to make sure everyone else benefits from it? Because we could say billionaires are building it for themselves, not for you. Here's how we take AI back. This is the kind of world we can live in if we do that, and we could paint that picture. So we could talk about progressive policies like shortening the work week, implementing UBI, universal health care, childcare, the kind of health advances we can see through AI, curing cancer, and all of those things that we don't know are going to happen, but certainly could be possible. And we could show how government could play a role in making those things happen, not just as some kind of like utopian progressive wish list, but as what we see as real dividends from what regular people, working people, and everyone have contributed to help make this AI technology possible. And in my view, that's a much more compelling message than just saying stop. Now, I definitely don't. I want to give them some credit. I don't think Senator Sanders and Representative Ocasio-Cortez are coming at this to stop technology. I think they are making a serious argument about power, about distribution, about who benefits, and we need to take that seriously. And that's what we should be channeling here. But just like the Luddites back in the day, their anger is real, and they're articulating something very real about the impact on people's lives, but the solution is not real. And we need to make sure that what people hear from this isn't AI isn't dangerous, AI is dangerous, AI is the enemy, AI is moving too fast, the left is all just about stopping it. We need to make sure that they're hearing a positive vision for what we can do if we do this right, what kind of world we could live in, how everyone could benefit, and not just say stop, stop, stop.
The part of the left critique of Republican policy of the laissez-faire situation that we're in is that there's unmet infrastructure needs. And we're going to talk about both energy and water. But I think it seems like this is a larger question, is that if you just get people thinking, oh, it's these particular construction projects, which what is going to be a dozen of them around the country, they may have bad impacts on their local communities that we have to look into. But the bigger problem, as I think you want to focus on, Matteo, is that we have, decades of unmet, deferred maintenance on our national infrastructure. And if we focused on that, we could take care of a lot of the issues that people are concerned with these AI data centers.
Yeah, I think, yeah, Ellie is correct about the framing that the left has about AI. And I think that this speaks to a larger change in the left over actually almost 50 years or so, which is moving from a generally positive, I don't mean that like in the positive thinking perspective, but in the constructive sense, that the left largely was based around forward thinking and construction and world building in, the or especially the first 100 years of the socialist project. It was all about world building and construction, and the fact that the socialist movement was way in advance of the kind of small-mindedness of the capitalist class and the rich, who were only concerned with their 3 to 5 year projections of profit. They were not thinking decades and centuries into the future, what the world could be, and to any degree that they thought about those things, it was really just co-opted from the visions of social radicals. And so for a very
Universal
long time,
access to sewers and electricity,
yeah,
was the backbone of the socialism.
yeah, and we saw that with social, yes, and with the Social Democratic Project,
Mhm.
even, it was somewhat watered down in the United States, but building out electricity, like you're saying, the rural electrification, creating a national grid, that was all very forward thinking and could not have happened without a social democratic project. And the social democratic project was always, at least for the first half of it, was really always, in negotiation with a further left project that was thinking about nationalization and how, if the people controlled infrastructure, what it could do and all these things. So a lot of the left today is really, as Ellie is saying, not wrong in looking at harms or looking at the injustices of various technology, but primarily the left is a critique, and is about resistance, which is of course necessary. Like that's at least half of the project. You have to critique a thing to get to the other side, but if you only critique a thing, there is no other side, right? Like, so right now we're stuck in this mode, which I think is probably, to point to myself and to your former career, like it's the problem of academia and the academicization, I think, of the left is like you're just incentivized to write critiques, to speak critiques, and to say like there's all these harms. There's a lot of harms to this, and there's a lot of harms to that. And that's not wrong, right? There are harms to various technologies, but to give a good analogy, um, we could think back to all the other monumental technologies of the past and to just put a point on what we now have as sort of a forward-thinking project, the Green New Deal, which a lot of it is techno-progressive. It's based on advancing the most advanced forms of transportation available today and getting fully in line with the present, right? Getting effectively to where China is, um, which is to build out a national high-speed rail system. Let's look at that specifically. Now, high-speed rail is an existing technology. It's been built in Europe and it's been built very fast in China. And yet it is a 200-year-old technology, a little bit older actually than 200 years. And right now it's like the kind of shining example of progressive technology. A train, it's so clean, it's quiet, it runs on electricity, it can be tied to renewables, and it gets people from, if you've seen AOC's video of high-speed rail when they first released the Green New Deal, it makes high-speed rail look utopian. It's a great video, by the way. And I agree, I love high-speed rail. I think it's an amazing thing. We should have it, but if you go
So you're
back to the
saying we
1800s,
we need ambitions of that scale in order to build the kind of infrastructural project that would accommodate an AI, a strong AI future. That's the place you're going, right?
yes, but remember what the history of the rail was,
Hmm.
right? The early the early history of the railroad was utterly barbaric. It was extremely inefficient and cruel. It used slave labor of various kinds all over the world. It displaced millions of people. They built all this completely useless infrastructure. They built lines to nowhere. They overbuilt constantly. There were constant crashes. Most of the economic crashes of you know, about 50 years of the 19th century, half the crashes at least were related to railroad speculation. So, and then additionally, the US Army like waged invasions of like hundreds of invasions to clear the land, and then they basically gave the land to the railroads. It's only now that it's under public control and that we now have the hindsight of 100 years since that has happened that now it's progressive. But
You know what a huge
think
irony of
ahead.
this is that China has built out high-speed rail to every corner of China, even places where nobody lives. And as a consequence, and it costs three times as much to ride the high-speed rail as the regular rail. And as a consequence, their rail systems are more than $1 trillion in debt. So, if you have a capitalist-driven set of incentives, you can overbuild, and if you have a communist set of incentives, you can overbuild. But in terms of the central government planning, if we had a left project to improve, we agreed that we needed to have AI and we need to have AI data center build out in order to be competitive in general. Um, Ellie, it seems like this is a direct example of the abundance argument. It's like, okay, yes, local communities are going to bitch and gripe about this shit, and the central government the federal government in this case, needs to take seriously some of those concerns and try to address them. And states can have some impact on where it gets built and how it gets built. But in general, if we make it a national priority, it has to override some of that bitching and griping at the local level.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I don't want to diminish the concerns that people have at the local level. Of course, those concerns should be taken seriously. And even the most the full bore abundance types don't say that you should just ignore every single local concern. And I think there are things that we can do, and I think we might get into this a little bit later. There are regulations that could be put in place that could make sure that there's less harm done to local communities. We want power plants, but we don't necessarily want power plants next to playgrounds. And we have regulations in place to make sure that doesn't happen. But yeah, so I think that there's two kind of levels that we could think about this. There's what can the federal government do now that we have this data center build out happening to guide that, to make sure that it's done well, to regulate it, and also to take benefits that it accrues and make sure that they're spread more evenly. And then there's regulations at the local level to minimize the impact that it has on people, to minimize the impact that it has on the environment, on water, making sure that we have data centers in places where is more water and not in places, where there's less water. That seems like an obvious one. But yeah, but when it
And
comes to the federal level,
a data center doesn't
yeah.
need arable water, right? It only needs brown water, gray water, and uh, a lot of other water uses compared to I mean, this is the Hank Green intervention that I appreciated so much because I really trust Hank Green, the Hank Green YouTube video where he tried to look at this dispassionately. He said, look, it's like corn uses 80 times as much water in the United States. Should we ban corn? And so anyway, go ahead.
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think the rhetoric around water and electricity consumption is overblown. I think that doesn't mean there are no concerns on those fronts, but they are overblown. They're minimal right now, and there's small tweaks that could be made to make sure that they work right. But I think one thing that I look to is that there's a study, a new paper that just came out a couple weeks ago from a new group called the Searchlight Institute. Senior fellow her name is Jane Flegel.
Link in the
She
notes.
put out a report. We'll put that in the notes, and it talks about how we could use the data center build out to build an electric grid investment fund and use some of the power of the federal government to guide that process, to make sure that our electrical grid, which is falling behind generally, if AI didn't exist, we'd still have problems with our electrical grid, and to make sure that we're using this as an opportunity to invest and revitalize and fix the electrical grid, which for anyone who cares about clean energy, can't do clean energy without a powerful, strong, robust electrical grid. And this could be an opportunity to do that. And
So
I
that
see
would be
that as a much
corporate
more
tax.
techno-progressive take.
Would that be a corporate tax on the folks who want to build these data centers?
Yeah, so to create that fund that would then be invested in the grid and in the build out.
So, I mean, they're not going to like that. That's going to be a fight. I mean, every place where we want to restrict them is going to be a fight, but we just have to choose which places we want to restrict them, right? So, Matteo, you wanted to focus on the electrical grid, but did you look at the water issue? Do you agree that the water issue is overblown and not grounded in reality?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. As you've said, there are some issues with water usage depending on where it's sited, and they don't cite things based on whether or not water is available. They cite things based on tax incentives and the cost of land and other things, and minimal regulations. That's why they're citing most of the larger centers in rural areas where there's relatively low income, et cetera, like Holly Ridge, Louisiana. The one that they're building here in New Mexico is not in Albuquerque. It's in can't even remember the town, but it's in a very rural county in southeastern New Mexico. Doesn't have any water, so they have to build a lot of infrastructure to get the water there. And the problem with these projects is not really how much water they use in aggregate, but how the infrastructure is funded, who pays for it, and really the incentives that are set up. I mean, right now, this is not a problem only with AI. It's just that we're seeing a bunch of problems with neoliberalism are being kind of, to use the term, right, hyperscaled. Like these are most of the infrastructure of the United States and most of the systems that are set up to organize and fund them were already near collapse. And now we're seeing in just the span of a couple years what happens when declining usage. I mean, they had been going up in real terms like 1 or 2%, but per capita, they've been flat since like, I mean, power usage has been flat since like 1978. It's actually fallen a little bit since 1978 per person. It's gone up because the population's gone up.
Mhm.
But, you know, it's like 1% up per year, which is a little bit less than the total population increase from migration. So you have these problems mainly because we have infrastructure that dates back in every form of public infrastructure. There are there's like it's a lot of it is 75 to 100 years old. And
Well, with water, it
they're
would seem like the issues in the Southwest, all the water tables are already under stress, right? So
they're all in,
you don't want to have any of these things tapping the water table.
right. And I mean, again, they don't really care about that. If they have to build out infrastructure, they're not going to pay the full cost. So, and it is actually in the benefit of many of these companies that come together to build these projects to have them to be more expensive based on the incentives. The incentives are all very perverse in this situation. So if we wanted to build the lowest cost, most rational system, it would look very different from what they're doing. They're doing these things because they have a bunch of incentives based on how the money gets how the money gets how the funds get transferred into these projects, how stock prices respond to investment numbers. If you have a very large investment, like here, Project Jupiter is like $160 billion. That's enormous. I mean, that's like more than the whole state economy. That's more than the state GDP or state product or whatever. But if you have a number like that, stocks will go up. Investors will say that's a huge project. It's gonna be huge for data, right? And as you will know, if you study the situation around AI and data centers, it's largely NVIDIA invests in OpenAI,
It's a circle
OpenAI
jerk.
invests in Oracle, and
Yeah.
Oracle invests in NVIDIA, and it's like a big thing. So if you just keep putting out these huge numbers, it keep constantly inflates the stocks. Stocks inflating means there's more investors, more money for more projects. And this is a big problem if you have infrastructure that cannot be maintained. They need to do a lot to bring the infrastructure up to the kind of standards that they would need to expand it. I mean, they're calling for something like a 4x expansion of data centers by 2030. In
Ellie,
itself, that's not a problem, but under the current system, there's really no way to do it without a lot of problems to reliability and to a lot of costs being passed on to ordinary people. So I think we need to think about it more as a systems design problem. Like we can get the power, we can build more power plants, but there's no way to transfer the power. The grid is near is like is like on its last legs and has been for more than a decade, but this is really bringing that, kind of painfully into being. And like Ellie said, it is also an opportunity to like actually solve this problem.
And I think
Ellie,
on the
go ahead.
political,
Yeah.
yes. Oh, on the political side, I think what you said, I think connects directly to some of the challenges that we have on the political front and why this fight is so important on the left to make sure that we get right. Because right now, what we're seeing is a situation where you have blue states that are making it harder and harder to build data centers, which pushes data centers to red states, which I think I don't know if this is a perfect correlation, but there's also just happens to be a correlation with red states and more some of these environmental and water issues that we talked about. Having the data centers in Oregon, Washington State, California, upstate New York is much better than having them in New Mexico, Texas. But the more that these blue states are pushing the stop and throwing up roadblocks, the harder it is for them to have any leverage in getting data centers and companies to do it right. I think you could then generalize this to the global scale, which is one of my main critiques with a just pause AI data centers in the United States bill, which is that if we stop them in the United States, you're moving them to countries where there's less visibility, there's fewer worker protections, there's fewer environmental protections. There's no ability for us to use any leverage to guide and use it as an opportunity for us to do things like build out our electrical grid. So I see these have problems happening at the local level and then also at the global level when we talk about a bill like this.
So some people have said that AI data center growth in the last year, if we took that out of the economy, there wouldn't have been any significant economic growth in the last year. So it is a very significant part of our economy. And people also, as an accelerationist argument, argue that our competition with China, that China is going to go in this direction. China's got these models. I mean, China's also the one that released DeepSeek a year ago, which only used 1% of the energy of the current models. So China's innovations in these fields may save us all. We'll just have to see. But the competition with China is, of course, centerpiece of this whole debate. Where are you, Ellie, in terms of the China competition part of it?
I think it's something that needs to be taken seriously. Like I said before, that I don't buy into the idea that this is a pure race. I think that there's benefits, like you said, when China develops something, we
Yeah.
can benefit from that, and when we develop things, the rest of the world can benefit from that. But AI has the potential to be such a powerful technology, and as Matteo noted, it also has military applications, intelligence applications. I would much rather that we develop AI and that we are at the forefront of AI here in America, where we can have, while our democracy is not as strong as it should be, we still have some ability to weigh in and to have our policymakers guide this in a way that I have more confidence can be done in China right now. So I think that that is a major concern. I think that this bill is not passing in the form it's in right now anytime soon. But if it did, it would certainly put us behind and help China move forward.
Yeah.
Matteo, one of the things that you're concerned about is the electrical grid in general, but also in particular the shifting of the burden, the financial burden to residential users. So this is a part of Bernie and AOC's legislation. Are you on board with the idea that we don't want residential power users to be paying for the costs of AI data center growth?
Yeah, I am, and it's a very complicated way that it, gets passed on. It often gets passed on whether or not data centers get built or turned on, because the way that new infrastructure gets built is based on future projected demand, and that future projected demand gets determined at these auctions, which are, kind of closed door events. And auctions, the last few auctions that have happened have been record breaking because the companies that are building, data centers and, tech companies have an incentive to shop around and to see, it's like I said, it's a race to the bottom. Like, who can offer us the least restrictions?
Matteo, stay in frame.
Something wrong?
You're just a little bit off frame there. Yeah, good.
They're good?
Go ahead. Yeah, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, they're incentivized to go to the places where there's just like Ellie said, the least restrictions, the least regulation, the lowest cost to themselves. So they want to get special deals. They want to get tax incentives and tax abatements, right? In fact, ideally pay no taxes, get a rebate, get paid money to come there. And this is a big problem. And that as they're shopping around, the numbers that they're throwing out, like we're going to build a 3 gigawatt, a 5 gigawatt center, that gets calculated into the future projected demand, which again, it doesn't, all the utilities that are in the auction know it's that a lot of these numbers are just proposed. They're not actually real numbers. But of course, they're not going to say anything because they're incentivized. They will then get paid higher amounts. The more proposed projected demand there is, the more profits those companies can make, and they're capped. So in a market where they're a monopoly, a protected monopoly and capped by certain regulations, the only way they can really make substantial profit is if they build new infrastructure. And that has not been necessary for a long time. And the only way to make it necessary in a legitimate way would be to build out a national program, and that has eluded us for like 3 decades almost.
I don't know
So
that we've explicitly addressed nuclear power, but I was convinced by the eco-modernists that nuclear power needs to be part of our energy, future. And I suspect that this is another place where there's still a big fight on the left, that attempting to use nuclear. But most of the discussion of the build out of energy for AI data centers is focused on nuclear power. Is that your impression as well?
yeah, I mean, there are what, two projects that are going to be, they haven't been put on yet, but 3 Mile Island and then the other one in Iowa are, and there's a couple others. There's one in, there's Indian Point in New York that's turned off, and then there's one in Michigan, and there's Oyster Creek in New Jersey. There are some power plants that can be turned back on, but because of nuclear regulation, it's very difficult to build new plants. I mean, the Vogtle plant took like 28 years or something and cost like $30 billion to build 4 gigawatts. I think actually it's 3 gigawatts, four now total. But so we could fix the nuclear regulation problem, that would be very good. And I think many of these problems could be fixed if we didn't live in an extremely complicated, um, it is a highly regulated market, but it's regulated in such a way as to prevent innovation, really. I mean, it's not really some of these, of course, some of the regulations are to our benefit, right? Like, there's more safety in nuclear, for instance. But to build new nuclear is like near impossible right now. I mean, it costs so much money. Like, you would have to be really foolish to like propose a plant, and whatever number they give you is going to be 3 times as much. It's going to take 3 times as long. So to fix that requires overhauling the entire energy sector,
Well,
the way
I
that
mean,
it's
it's
governed.
it's the it's the announced intention of the Trump administration, isn't it, Ellie, to facilitate the immediate build out of nuclear? I don't know if they've made any progress on that, but isn't there a beltway
I have
focus now on nuclear that there wasn't before?
many
Yeah,
doubts.
yeah, yeah. Again, I think that it remains to be seen if that will move. But I think that well, again, I hate to ever give Trump credit for anything. I think I would at least support that in principle. That I think when we look back at at the last 30 years of the pushback against nuclear, I think there's a growing consensus that that was a huge mistake, and that if we had not done back then what the left is proposing now to do on AI, and not just said stop, and instead said let's find a way to do this safely and responsibly. And I think we would be in a much better place now on electricity costs, on the climate crisis, and other issues. So I think that there's a pretty interesting analogy to be made there. Not a perfect one. And I would say on your question about residential electricity costs, I think that that's a really important issue. And I think one of the values that we as techno-progressives bring to this conversation is that we're going to say that the costs should be borne fairly and the benefits should be distributed equitably. And this is clearly a case where the costs are not being borne fairly. And this, to me, seems a much stronger place for the left to be fighting to make sure that these costs are borne fairly, and not just where data centers happen to be placed, but that there's mechanisms in place, whether it's on the taxation side, the regulation side, some kind of insurance pool side. I think that the Searchlight report says some stuff on. I think that there are ways that we could go about doing that to make sure that people aren't bearing the costs unfairly just because they happen to live near a data center.
There is an issue that's related to abundance as well about corporate secrecy, right? It's like how much if we have local review, environmental review, or whatever kinds of review build for the building of these things, um, the local communities are demanding access to certain kinds of information that they may or may not have access to within our current legal system. Do you see that as an issue?
Yeah, yeah. I think that is an issue, and I think that this is another place where the government can play an important role, both at the federal level and if needed, if there's no action on the federal level, at the local level, that are mandated transparency requirements. I think that it's hard to really justify the opposite side of that. And again, yeah, I put this also on the list of of policies that the left can fight for to make this go better, as opposed to just saying stop.
Gemini wanted me to ask that question. It said here, tech companies frequently use non-disclosure agreements with local officials when planning hyperscale data centers. They keep the public in the dark about a facility's potential impact on local water supplies, power grids, and air quality. And while they claim the NDAs are necessary for competitive secrets, citizens often argue the opposite. So, yeah, it wasn't something that we had talked about before, but it popped out of these topics. So, what kinds of subsidies do you think the public should give for a project like this, Matteo? If we're saying, yeah, I mean, I think we all agree that OpenAI, if they're going to get $1 trillion to build a data center, we want them to pay a special rate on the electricity so that we don't shift those costs to the residential consumer. We want them, of course, to pay for all the environmental remediation that would be necessary. Perhaps we want them to pay into a special fund that might expand the grid. But at the same time, as Ellie said, if the democratic states, the blue states, demand much more of that from these firms and the red states don't, then all of this build out and the whatever derivative economic benefits of them will go to red states. And just like housing and everything else, the democratic states are shooting themselves in the foot, basically. So the flip side of that is we give tax breaks. Traditionally states would give a tax break if there was going to be some kind of benefit. And a lot of red states are offering tax breaks for these things. So do you see any role for public subsidization to steer or incentivize the building of these things?
Well, that's an interesting question. What confuses me about this power question and Bernie and AOC's response to it is that they didn't rely on their own program from the Green New Deal and what Bernie ran on in 2016, which was nationalizing the grid. And, it seems like, far-fetched maybe, but I don't think it is. I think the powers, again, the way that we organize the power system in the United States is really arcane, both technically and socially. It's very, very complicated, unnecessarily complicated. And that is a huge strain, and it places a lot of burden on ordinary people. And it could be alleviated by just having it run as a national public utility. And it doesn't have to be run in a very inefficient way, like you're saying with China, because it doesn't have to be a way to just inflate GDP, which I think is the reason why this happens in China. It could be run with more sophisticated feedbacks based on perhaps AI systems, right? Like we could create something similar, but like significantly more sophisticated than CyberSyn in Chile, which was used to just as background. It was used as a national planning mechanism in the 1970s under Salvador Allende's government to try and figure out how to use live feedback in order to run and plan the economy with workers, with the factories, with a lot of real-time economic data. And we could do something similar with the electrical grid. We need a lot of real-time feedback. We can't just have people in this right now we have a situation which is much worse than even the situation that you're speaking to in China, which is where people in a back room sit around with fake numbers. They're like, in the last one in Virginia, they said there's going to be projected possibly 700 gigawatts worth of data centers. Obviously, that's a made-up number. There's no way that would be more than the entire residential and commercial power generation of the whole country. So right now, people are just talking about fake numbers. They're making stuff up, and it's causing a lot of problems instead of using real-time feedback. Now, what does that require? Like in regulation, it requires us to know actually what is required from these data centers. Like, what kind of power will they use? Like as we talked about in the last in the pro worker AI one, like we need transparency. We don't know at all what the models are doing. We don't need to know like the exact coding, but we need transparency as to the actual energy usage and the effectiveness of these um, models and what they could be used toward. And it would be much better if you could only maybe make one project at a time. Like not one project, but like if you're going to make a project, instead of like proposing it to 50 different places and having those numbers be inflated everywhere, you we need some more rational system that where regulations say we're going to cite those projects where there's abundant cool water, like the Great Lakes. We're going to cite them maybe offshore where we have offshore wind. We're going to co-locate that with offshore wind or with, if we're going to do it in the Southwest, it could be around, the Great Salt Lake or some other cool water source that's near also a very good place for solar. Like there are rational ways we could plan this, but that can only be done if we have it as a public utility.
Right.
Otherwise, we have these very perverse incentives. As to your question about subsidies, I'm all for subsidies if the data centers are needed to solve problems that the public, sees as worthwhile projects, which is a political question. And we don't always agree with, the average person, of course, you know, but solving cancer, like figuring out how to solve the microplastic problem that RFK says he's going to solve now. These are like really, I don't think he will, but we we have these big problems that we could use AI for, and in those cases which could include private companies, but really on the terms of the public, like we're going to have this infrastructure which is primarily publicly funded, which is primarily through in IP that was created by public research. So it should be run similar to the way NASA's run. NASA includes many private contractors. Some of it is built directly by NASA, and some of it is built by Lockheed Martin or Boeing or now SpaceX. But it's controlled by NASA. It's all NASA. It's not like Lockheed Martin is controlling the space program and the US is like, well, maybe we can like kind of incentivize you to have the Artemis project. Like, no, we don't want that. If we want to go to the moon, then we have a moon project. We have Congress fund it, and that's obviously a political question, and a lot of people disagree with moon funding, sure, but we can make the argument at least. And it has been funded. The space program has been well funded. I mean, more funded than people think. And I think we could do something similar with AI. I mean, and that would incentivize these companies instead of using AI to sometimes, as we spoke about last time, automate in a way that doesn't really work, that it kind of replaces a job, but like it only does it maybe 75% as well, or maybe kind of just as well. But then there's these gaps, and then you have to have these people doing cleanup on the back end, and those people are in Pakistan or they're in Nigeria and they're getting paid very little and they're having to like intervene all the time. Okay, that's not how we want to do automation, right? We want to incentivize robust automation that actually can reduce workload and improve productivity and improve abundance overall. And so I think it doesn't, I'm not going to say, that we need to have it be 100% publicly owned wall to wall. You know, I don't want to be overly prescriptive in that way, but I do think that from a left perspective, we want to be always on the side of pushing toward that kind of surplus and making sure that that surplus benefits a large number of people. That doesn't mean that no individual people will benefit more if they contribute more. But right now we have a situation where like 6 people are benefiting because they're pumping up each other's stocks,
Well,
and Nvidia is worth more than Japan.
the support for AI data regulation also is related to the support for huge settlements against Meta and YouTube. It's just everyone hates these oligarchs. And it's like anytime we can take money out of their pocket, they're going to support that. I'm not sure that that translates to support for nationalization. Like I think we should nationalize SpaceX. SpaceX is too integral a part of our federal infrastructure. Maybe we pay him $1 billion and say, go away, and just take over the infrastructure. But I'm for it. But I want to ask you, Ellie, like there are two frames in which the techno-progressive project needs to get defined in order for it to be politically feasible. And one is the public-private frame. And yes, I mean, I'm open to nationalization. I recognize that nationalization is a long way away as a legitimate policy goal, even of, the Democratic Party, much less the country. The other is how quickly emerging technologies are coming that would change the contours of the debate. And one of the things that people have discussed in this context, unfortunately, Elon Musk is one of them, but because he has SpaceX, is putting data centers in space as a potential way to alleviate some of these fights that we're having about where to put them on Earth. But there's also like, how quickly will AI become more energy efficient? DeepSeek, as I mentioned, was significantly more energy efficient than the other models, and we continue to make progress in having more energy efficiency. Now, the more energy efficient we get, we have that paradox where something gets cheaper, more people use it, and then actually in the long run, it's being used more than you thought. And so, but it seems like how optimistic are you that we can solve some of these problems with techno fixes as opposed to regulatory fixes?
Well, I think it's not an either or, and I think
Yeah.
that's what draws me to this the techno progressive position on lots of issues is that we can combine this optimism and hope with the idea that that's just not just going to happen all on its own, and that you can't just let it rip and just hope for the best, but that you need to have government play a role and people play a role in making sure that we get to the kind of future that we think is possible. So I think that the things that we're pushing back against are, of course, we're pushing back on, what we talked about a lot, the left saying, the Luddite left, the anti-technology left, who are saying we need to stop everything. But we're also pushing back against the libertarian right and the let it rip right, who are saying we don't need any regulations. Who would try to apply some of the same arguments that we're applying against the left saying stop to us saying regulate. I think they're just wrong. I think that we can make the case for we need to move fast because that there's real benefits that people can see in their lives, and all of the things that progressives have been talking about for so long, from UBI to universal health care and more, are only possible if we make some advances on the technological side. I think we look back at history and see that technology has accomplished so many progressive priorities, whether that's, something as basic as electricity or the internet, where anyone right now in America can read anything that's ever been written ever. And that's something that 50 years ago, of course, couldn't happen. But this isn't going to go well unless we have a strong government role in regulating this, in guiding it, and making sure that it reflects what people actually need and that benefits get spread evenly. So I think on the subsidies question, I think that that's a great example of how government can play a role in this. I think that there's a question of whether states should be providing subsidies to these companies at all. I think we have a stupid system where there's kind of a race to the bottom among states, and it leads to some silly outcomes. But setting that aside, I think what's more important is what you get for those subsidies. And if there's going to be subsidies, they should focus on making sure that the local communities are protected, that there's investments made maybe in workforce training, in broadband access for rural communities that still don't have that kind of broadband access that many people have. And then, of course, certainly in the environmental protections and those kind of things. And I think we could do that in a way that doesn't just stop it and that doesn't just force it out of those states and out of this country, but is reasonable. And we've figured this out in many other industries. I think we could do it here.
Matteo, final thought?
Yeah, I think those are good points. I agree that when I'm talking about nationalization, as you're saying, I'm not thinking about it only in kind of valorizing the present, right? It is really, how do we think about technology as a world building project, and how do we steer that world building project? Right now, I think there's just, again, I keep thinking back to past technologies, like the way that the railroad was being designed in the past, the way that it kind of just was a total mess, going all over to nowhere, the way that it was really violently built was first stopped, ironically, by the creation of Vanderbilt's monopoly on the railroad, and then, and by subsequent monopolies, and now by nationalization or quasi-nationalization with Amtrak. It was done better in other countries, a lot better. So the American example is actually a poor example of nationalization, but it could have been a lot better. It could have been like the Japanese example, where nationalization not only brought sanity and, really good planning to the rail system, but brought untold innovation to the system. It really brought to bear some of the best minds in that society to build the best train system in the world. It's still, you know,
Their
I mean,
high-speed rail, the Shinkansen, it's the model of the world. Yeah.
it's and it's this. It is so. There's like, I don't think there's been any deaths on the train in its whole existence. I think since 1964, which is unbelievable, but from American standards. I mean, there are ridiculous trade-offs that we're constantly making in the United States that are, even when you have a highly regulated system, like the regulations have to be much more complicated and much more onerous and much thicker than they are in Japan. And yet it is less regulated in some sense. Like, they have less total regulations, but the regulations they have are very rational and they work, and they're developed by people who know how to build a train system. They're not built in this really weird fashion where people who know nothing about trains, know nothing about how to build engineering projects, are making these decisions, which happens all the time in the US. This is what we have,
I think
and
that
that was the major thing with abundance, right? They're talking about how people who know nothing about how to build abundant housing at all, know nothing about how housing is made, know nothing about how to make it affordable, are making these decisions constantly. And that's one of the reasons why housing is not affordable, because we have people who know nothing about it running the regulations.
Well,
And
I
so,
think, as you're pointing out, the hard left should be open to the idea that the regulatory state that was built in the United States as a compromise between the overweening power of capital and the, inconsistent efforts of democratic regulation, that's a broken system, and that we need to wipe it away and replace it with something that's a lot more rational. So,
yeah,
critiquing the
better regulation.
they're critiquing the regulatory state, even when the right critiques it. Sometimes they're right about those critiques. So, yeah. Well, this has been a great conversation, and of course, it's you can get into the weeds on all these topics, but we will put links in the show notes so that people can follow up on some of the things that we've mentioned: the energy issues, the water issues, the legislative proposals from Bernie and AOC. Thank you so much for joining me, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thanks.
The Technoprogressive Hub is sponsored by the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies and hosted by me, Jay Hughes. Find us at Substack at Technoprogressives.